What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Jacob Turner. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to you and your situation. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
All opinions expressed on this show are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on the Long Game Podcast should be considered advice. Always consult with your team of professionals before making any decisions regarding your finances.
Right, what is up, and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. I'm your co-host, Thomas Kopelman, here with me, Jacob Turner. Jacob, what's up, man? Excited to talk interest rate changes and everything that comes along with that with you today.
I feel like we've kind of been selfish. Hopefully it's helping listeners, but I feel like we're selfish on the podcast this year because we're talking so much about home ownership because we both recently purchased new homes. But I do think the interest rate environment is really interesting right now, and talking through like how I think how we think about it with our own situations, and then secondarily, if somebody is going to make a change, like what are the options that are out there? When should they? When shouldn't they? Because it's not as easy as just saying, "Hey, interest rates are dropping. I'm going to go refinance," or, you had a great post today about recasting your mortgage, which I think a lot of people don't even understand that concept.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's kind of surprised me how many people have reached out and been like, I didn't even know this was a thing. So I think this is perfectly timed, right? Because what we've seen is in the last, couple weeks, this is going to come out obviously a couple weeks after this, though, that interest rates on mortgages have dropped from 7 point, I think it was like 4 to like 6.5 pre any declines. And so I think one thing that people don't realize is that mortgage rates actually are predictive of things that are happening, right? So they don't have to wait for the Fed to come out and decrease interest rates by 0.5% to actually go and make those changes. But like everything that I'm seeing on predictions wise is 0.5% in September with 2 more rate cuts this year, and then a bunch next year where we're sitting at, low threes. And so what comes with that is a lot of opportunities, right? So you and I, especially if you bought a house in this last year, you're probably in the sevens, right? I don't know about you. My interest rate's like a 7.25. And so that's going to create opportunities to refinance. My mortgage lender already reached out and said, hey, you want to refinance, we can get down to 6.4. And for me, that's about $500 a month less. And so I think a lot of times people hear that, they're like, great, let's refinance, let's call it a day. And I think that's a mistake. And the reason why it's a mistake is because if you're going to be living somewhere long-term, like you kind of want to get this right. And it's kind of the same as investing in the stock market, right? Like you're never going to perfectly time it, but you still do want to think about it here, right? If this is what the rates are before any declines, I think it's safe to assume that, hey, unless something crazy happens, interest rates are probably going to be reduced. And this is where people say, well, who cares? I'll just refinance again. And the problem is that every time you refinance, you have closing costs. This could be $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $8,000. Like closing costs are not necessarily the cheapest thing. And so if you refinance and it costs $5,000, sure, you can choose to not pay it up front. You can roll it into that new mortgage. But if it saves you $300 a month, it's not as easy as like, okay, just refinance right away, because that's just under 2 years until you break even. So what happens if 4 months later you want to refinance again and it has that cost again? And then 4 months later you want to refinance and it has that cost again. And you've just been incurring all of these costs. And you might be at $1,000 a month cheaper, but you might have just paid $12,000 in closing costs, right? So if you think about that, that's going to take, over a year. And so I think one big part of refinancing is just understanding that you kind of want to wait it out. You're never going to get it perfect, but you don't want to refinance right at the first decline. But you also want to understand the math, right? It's not as simple as I save $500 a month. It's a no-brainer. You have to think about the closing costs and how long you plan to live there. And for me, I'm like, okay, I might live here for 2 years before we have to upgrade because of kids and things like that longer. If that happens, right, and I move within 2 years, is the closing costs and the monthly savings, are they going to offset? Is the closing cost more than what the monthly savings over 2 years would be? You really have to look at all those numbers to make that decision.
Yeah, so I have your tweet pulled up here to talk through a specific situation that you outlined, because I think it's helpful for people listening to understand exactly what you're talking about. Like this isn't as easy as just saying interest rates go down. So the example that you gave was Kayla and Adam, their current interest rate was 7%. So their payment was $4,000. New interest rate was 5%. So they're getting 2% less on their interest rate, which is a significant difference. Okay. So their new pay. Yeah, so their new payment goes to 3,200. So it's $800 a month that they're saving, but the closing costs are $6,000. So instead of just saying like we're going to save $800 a month, we got to understand what the closing costs are. And what you map out here is, hey, if we look at this, if we save $6,000, if we spend $6,000 on the closing costs, they need to live in the house for at least 7.5 months for it to make sense.
So pretty
So it's
simple.
it's a pretty simple math equation, but it takes more than just saying interest rates have declined, or like you said, hey, my lender reached out and he wants to do this. Now, look, you could refinance today and say like, hey, I have, I'm getting a percentage off or a percentage and a half off, and I'm just going to ride with it. And if in 12 months or 18 months interest rates are significantly lower, I'll just pay the closing costs again.
True.
That could still be a good situation for you, because the one thing I would encourage everybody listening is you need to understand specifically with the lender that you're working with what those closing costs look like. We've worked with some clients where their lender is saying like, hey, the closing costs are going to be near minimal, right? Because they want to have a new loan on the books. The other thing, though, to think about is like when you get the new loan on the bucks, the new amortization is going back to, if you get a 30-year, it's going back to a 30-year. So you're paying essentially more towards interest than you are paying towards principal. So there's all these other factors to consider. But I think it's important to just take the extra step. Like anybody at home can do this math equation and figure out in 30 minutes how long they would need to stay in the property, or how long it would take for them to just be at break, even if they wanted to refinance again in a year or two.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point. Like in the example that you use, there's a pretty big interest rate change. So, like, if you somehow got a 7.8 or something at the worst time, and now you can do a 6.5, it might be worthwhile, right? That's a pretty big interest rate change. That's $1 million house. That's going to be a big monthly payment change. And then you could say, hey, at least I cut it in half. If rates only go to 6.2 or 6.3, like that's not worth it. But if 1 to 2 years from now I can go again to 5 or 5.5 and make it worth it, at least I got halfway to where I want to go. But this is where it becomes really situational, right? Like the time that you live there really matters. And it's a guess, right? Like nobody can predict if you got a new job next year and you need to move across. But I can predict that I know I'm going to need a new house. I know that at some point in the next 2 to 4 years, we're going to move somewhere where we can raise a family. So if the math doesn't really math in that time frame, at least we know if there's something that pushes me up that's unexpected, like that's life, right? Financial planning changes as your life circumstances change. We need to take the best guesses we can and make decisions based on that.
One thing that it comes to mind for me, though, is you want to be proactive instead of being reactive. So in this scenario, being proactive is either you doing the math or reaching out to the person that you trust, that you're getting your money decisions from, whether that's your financial advisor, your CPA, a friend, whoever it may be. Being reactive is saying, hey, my mortgage lender called me and he said I should refinance, so I'm going to go ahead and refinance. There's a big difference between those two. And it's not to say that the lender is wrong. You just want to make sure that in your specific situation that it makes sense, because what the lender is saying isn't untrue, right? Interest rates have gone down, your monthly payment would be less. All those things are true. But chances are he probably doesn't know what your financial planning situation is going to look like for the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. And you want to make sure that your financial planning situation aligns with that potential refinance. Because again, the other thing that I think is really interesting is like I love Dave Ramsey. Some people hate Dave Ramsey. He talks about paying off your house. Whether you want to pay off your house or not, I actually am in the camp that like having some debt is not a bad thing, because you have a lot of flexibility with it. So even for people that are looking at their high interest rate and they're saying, oh man, like I really want to pay this off because I have a 7.5% interest rate. And should I pay this off? Should I invest the money? I think the other thing to think about too in all this is like, if interest rates go down, now all of a sudden that 7.5% debt at 5% looks pretty good. And you're saying, hey, I love the flexibility of having the cash in addition to what else I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the other thing to also at least consider is what if you change the time frame of your mortgage? Like, is it worth taking and doing some analysis, right? Like, if you're used to a 7.4% mortgage at 30 years and you have plenty of surplus, like that's easy for you to pay. You could actually even pay a little bit more. It might be worthwhile to take a look at what does a shorter loan look like if you can refinance lower. I looked and it said that a 15-year mortgage, the lowest offers right now are about 5.6%. If I refinance my 30-year at 7.2 to a 15-year at 5.5, it's only like $600 a month more. And I'm like, okay, well, hey, instead of 600 some thousand in total interest, it's 263. right? Like that's a really big difference. And I'm typically in the camp of 30-year mortgage. If you want to pay it off quicker, pay it off in 15. But I think you still want to take a look. It was like 0.8% lower than a 30-year mortgage was at that period of time. And so I'm not saying do it, but it's at least worth analyzing, especially if you're somebody like me who your mortgage is really low relative to your income and you have that room. It could be a good option to at least consider and do the math on.
Yeah, the other thing that I like, and this is very dependent on the situation, I would not recommend this for a lot of people out there, but I think, Thomas, for a lot of our clients, like using an arm, whether it's a 5-year arm or a 7-year arm, can make a ton of sense. And so for people that don't know what an arm means, it's just an adjustable rate mortgage. So what it means is you're still paying on the same 30-year amortization schedule as a typical 30-year mortgage, but at the end of that 5-year term or at the end of that 7-year term, the rate becomes adjustable. And you just don't know what that's going to look like. But even for me in my situation, I did a 7-year arm on the property I have right now. And the reason why I did it was I said, hey, in 7 years, either I'm going to have this house paid off or interest rates are going to be lower and I'll refinance. And I could have the optionality to do either one of those, but it gave me a lot lower interest rate than if I did a 30-year. And this is something that if you're a really high earner or you have additional flexibility with a taxable account or some sort of access to capital, this is another thing that I would encourage people to look at. I think it goes back to the idea of being proactive versus being reactive. This is not the right move for a lot of people. Like if you are living in a situation where a lot of your expenses are getting eaten up or your paycheck is getting eaten up by a lot of your expenses and the mortgage is a big one of that, I would not take on the additional risk of having any sort of adjustable rate mortgage. But if you do have the optionality, you're earning a lot of money, you have a little bit of more control over your income, maybe you own a business, it could potentially make sense to look at that and say, hey, if I could save a percent and a half, it might make sense for me to do this.
Yeah, and I think, at least in my experience, I've seen arms are something that are not advantageous unless you're putting 20% down. A lot of times when you're putting less, they actually don't have much of an interest rate. I looked at it because I thought, in a high interest rate environment, arms are better. In a low interest rate environment, I'd say not as much. I definitely have clients who regret having a 2.62% arm when they could
Mm.
have had a fixed of, under 3%, but they took the 5 or 7 year
Oh,
arm. And all of a sudden, if interest rates are where they are now, their housing cost is going to be 2.5x. But in an environment where we feel like we're at the top, you can get a discount on that rate. And we think we can refinance within the next 3, 5, 7 years, whatever we pick. It can be a really great option. Um, you go.
the last point I want to make on this too, though, is nobody knows what's going to happen with interest rates. So the market is forward looking. It's saying that they think interest rates are going to go down, and that may be true. I would say the odds are better that they're going to go down. But let's not forget. I'll still remember in 2013, which was when I bought my first house, people were saying, oh, interest rates will never go lower. They're only going to go higher. Okay. Interest rates then on a 30-year mortgage were about 3.5%, 3.5%, 4%. Okay. And I remember literally everybody telling me this, like all the older people that had all the wisdom were saying, like, interest rates will never go lower than they are right now. Okay. 2021 happens, 2020 happens, 2022. We're talking significantly lower interest rates than that. I just say that because we don't know what's going to happen. And this is why I say it's really important for you to plan and just make the best decision you can. Thomas, I think you made a great point earlier that like you can't time this perfectly. Trying to time this perfectly is like trying to time the S&P 500 when it's going to hit the bottom. It's impossible to do. You got to go into your situation, understand your planning, understand what your cash flow looks like, and make the best decision for you now. But I do think it's important when you make that decision to understand, hey, if interest rates do go lower, here's what my options look like. But if interest rates go higher, here's why I'm going to make this move today or wait.
Yeah. Totally agree. I think there's a couple things to hit on still in this episode. So I think one of them is just about basically recasting your mortgage. I think we can talk about this really quick, but something that people don't know about is you can recast your mortgage. And what recasting your mortgage is basically re-amortizing the loan based on the balance that you have. And so there's a lot of people, like you said, I want to try to pay off my mortgage in 7 years. And so when you're doing that, you might once a year be like, oh, I got a bonus, or I'm taking a bunch of profits out of the business and I'm going to go put down $50,000 on your mortgage. What people don't know is that you can recast it, which means re-amortize it based on the new balance. So if you basically, let's say you had a $400,000 mortgage and you put down $50,000 at the end of the year, they could recast your mortgage based on that lower balance. So you have a lower monthly payment. It's not available on all loans, but it is an option on many. It comes with a small, typically like $250 or $500 fee. If you're somebody that's putting a ton down, this can be a really good option. Also, if you have a high interest rate and you're putting a bunch down and you're going to refinance, I mean, putting it down as you refinance could be a really good option as well. I don't think there's too much that we want to hit on
Well,
there, but
the other use case for a recast is if you, let's say interest rates do drop and you're in the market to buy a home and you're looking at your dream house, you finally found it, interest rates have dropped, you're ready to buy it. Okay, so you buy it, and but then you say, now I have to put my house in the market, and you have a little bit of a gap period between when you're buying the new house and when you're selling your other house. You could put down less money, recast the mortgage 30 days later, and then go back to however much you actually wanted to have down in the first place. Because in this
that's a
scenario,
good
like,
one.
a lot of your money is tied up in your current house. You buy the new house, you put down 10, 20%, whatever it is, but you say, hey, I really want to put down 50%. And you're taking then some of the profits from the house
Mm-hmm.
that sells, let's call it 2, 3 weeks later, you can then recast it. And potentially that $250 fee makes a lot of sense to do that.
Such a good point. And I should have brought it up myself because had the conversation with 3 clients last week, all about to buy a new house. And typically, the strategy we have with people is have a HELOC, use the HELOC to bridge the gap while you wait to sell the house. There's always going to be some time, then get the cash, then go pay it down and recast it. Very, very common strategy. But a lot of people don't plan for that liquidity. And you might not want to save for 2 years to have 20% down to bridge that gap when you could just pay interest costs for 1 or 2 months while you have the HELOC. So really good point. Other thing that I wanted to talk about is just like as interest rates drop, a lot of things change. So one is you do want to look at all your loans, right? Is there car loans? Is there business loans, et cetera? Is there opportunities to refinance? And if you can, do that. The other one is as interest rates drop, you're also going to get less overall of interest rates like on your cash, on money market funds, etc. So you really want to think about, do we have the right amount of cash on hand? Are we just holding cash because it has a good interest rate? Because in all reality, that's going to drop over time.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people that have a lot of cash to understand what the delta is between your cash position and what your debt looks like, because people get so up in arms about what interest rates are or what they've been over the past 12 months. But let's say you have a mortgage that has a 7% interest rate. Well, right now, a money market position is paying about 5%. Okay, so you can earn about 5%, essentially risk free. So your delta is 2%. Now, let's rewind the clock to 2020, and your interest rate maybe on your mortgage was 3%, but your money market position was only earning 1%. Okay, so the delta was actually still the same. So I think it's always important to understand when you're looking at debt, like understand what could I earn if I had this cash and I didn't put it towards my debt, and really what could I earn in like some sort of risk-free way. Now, look, there's risk to everything. You put money in your mattress, still risk there, not investment advice, but something to definitely look at.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, I feel like we hit on this one really well. Everybody, hopefully you found this helpful. I think, there's a lot of changes coming, whether interest rates, estate, taxes, like this is going to be a crazy next 2 years. So hopefully we're going to be here, educating you on everything as it comes. If you have questions or topics you want us to talk about, just feel free to reach out. But until next week, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you then.